So one of the other key differences between eukaryotes and the other lineages of life, archaea, bacteria, is that they are truly multicellular. So that begs the question, why and how did multicellular come about? What's the deal with that? So why is multicellularity important? Why be multicellular? Seems like a lot of work, right? So bacteria and archaea can live in colonies, all the same cell type, all basically doing the same thing, living together, and they get some extra protection and maybe some extra coordination by living together. But a truly multicellular organism can have cells which specialize in unique functions. Instead of all the cells doing all the things, instead of kind of every cell being a jack of all trades, now multicellular organisms can have unique cells in different regions that are doing very specific things very well, and other cells that are doing other things very well. One of my kind of favorite sayings in life is we all have our own strengths. We all do things somewhat better in some areas than others, right? It's kind of like what multicellularity is. Some cells are really, really good at digesting things. Some cells are really, really good at absorbing things, right? All cells are going to have their own unique strength in a multicellular organism. Okay, multicellularity also allows for organization, right? Now we can have different regions of the multicellular organism that, again, can carry out different functions. Okay, we have different cell types working together to create tissues and organs. We can have communication. Multicellularity requires communication, so making sure all the cells are on the same page, that they're talking to each other, that they're coordinating their processes together. And again, specialization. Different cells doing their own jobs that maybe another cell won't be carrying out, right? Muscle cells can't produce hydrochloric acid. They have the genes for it, but they don't, right? And stomach cells don't necessarily produce actin and myosin like muscle cells do. So why be multicellular? Size is important. If you're multicellular, you can be larger. The larger you are, the fewer things that can eat you, right? That's a big thing in the story of life. Specialization, I already talked about that. Being multicellular helps you to maintain an internal environment that is different and ideal for those cell types that is separate from the external environment, right? You get a protective layer and you can control that internal environment to a greater extent than if you're just a colony of organisms, or even if you're just one cell. If you're multicellular and you lose part of your body, you can potentially regrow that part instead of just dying, right? If you're one cell and you lose part of your cell, you're just done, right? So a plant can lose a leaf and regrow that leaf, can replace it, right? Also, if you're multicellular, you have protection of your reproductive cells. You can protect those really important gametes or gamete-producing cells inside, so that way they won't be damaged, that way you're protecting the goods, that way they can go on to the next generation. So I have this image here because I just want to drive home this idea of specialization and changes in structure and function in a multicellular organism, right? As opposed to all cells being the exact same, these are just a few of the different types of cells that we find in plants. Xylem and phloem for conducting sugars and water, right? Parenchyma cells for providing structural support. Parenchyma cells for storing starches, right? On the surface of the leaves, we have other different types of cells. Stomata cells or guard cells that are there to open and close the stomata, right? So multicellularity results in a huge amount of specialization, and all of these cells can work together to carry out more sophisticated processes that we see in unicellular organisms. So we think multicellularity evolved separately, independently, many different times, upwards of 30 different times, some estimates. So that would make it an analogy, right? So we think that multicellularity evolved separately, independently in different lineages of eukaryotic cells. But let's look at this example right here of Volvox and Chlamydomonas as an example of how multicellularity may have evolved, right? Because this is happening relatively recently, and so we can kind of trace this process of multicellularity. So this is a diagram of the phylogenetic tree of a clade of green algae, and these are the organisms at the end of each of these branches. right? And all these organisms still exist today in nature, right? These are not fossil, these are all still extant. So on the left-hand side, we have the single-celled algae, Chlamydomonas, and then on the right-hand side, we have the multicellular algae, Volvox. And if we look at the order of the branches in this clade, we can kind of see this almost stepwise progression from single-cellular to living in aggregate to living in colonies to being truly multicellular. So kind of the leading hypothesis here is that some of these cells would start to just kind of live together, probably by accident to produce an aggregate, and over time, some of these aggregates may accumulate mutations which promote organization within their different cells. An organization would be selected for because that's helpful for keeping all of those different cells together and maintaining structure within an organism to make all of their processes more efficient. So better at photosynthesizing, better at moving towards light, things like that. And so we think that's where we kind of start to see the spherical structure right here. We're starting to get some organization going on. Now we call these a colony. So we think that colonies we think that colonies arose twice in this clade, once here and once again here. But we can see that all of the cells in these colonies are still identical. There's no specialization in their structure or their function. So the next step is kind of accumulating mutations that allow for different cells to have slightly different functions. So cells are assigned different tasks, right? So which is what we start to see here in these organisms. These are truly multicellular. These organisms actually have a little bit of polarity to them. See how these ones are much, much, much larger on the bottom side? Larger cells, more chloroplast. Those are going to be the ones that are facing the sunlight to photosynthesize. And these ones down here are just kind of the motors. Just kind of motors to move around that organism so that way it can face the sunlight and get as much sunlight as possible, right? So photosynthesis, movement, so to specialize. So we think that something similar probably happened in most lineages of photosynthetic organisms that are now multicellular. In animals, though, we think that in animals that multicellularity arose only once, and we have a few lines of evidence from it. So we haven't talked about the different phyla of animals yet. It's a little bit of a preview. So we think that multicellularity arose in animals from a taxa of protists called choanoflagellates. So these choanoflagellates kind of live in a colony where they have these collar cells, these cilia that surround their flagella, and then they beat their flagella back and forth, move food in to trap the food within their cilia. Okay? And we think that they are the closest living relative of animals that are not multicellular, right? They're colonial. So we have a few lines of evidence here. So one, morphological. We find these types of cells, what we call collar cells in animals, in different lineages of animals. They're in sponges. There we find them in cnidarians, we find them in platyhelminthes, we find them in echinoderms, sea stars, right? Have very similar cells of this almost exactly same structure of those collar cells, which look like a choanoflagellate in these different organisms. We also have some evidence here of the cadherin proteins that are found in choanoflagellates as well as in animals. So the cadherin proteins are proteins that are expressed eventually on the surface of the cell. They kind of hold cells together, cadherin, right? And so we see similarities in the molecular sequence of those genes, but we see new mutations have arose in the truly animal lineages that we don't see in the choanoflagellates. Okay, so some segments of that gene are preserved, but new mutations have arose to give us new ways of using those existing proteins to keep all of the cells attached to each other. But the big idea here, though, is that multicellularity, you can be larger, you can specialize in the function of each of your cells, and multicellularity requires communication and organization between the cells.